All right, so today we're looking at behavior therapy. Like I mentioned, one of my all-time favorite techniques, and obviously, like, just like the name implies, that's like, oh, we're gonna be like doing, but we're gonna be applying therapy. It's like, no. Like, again, like, we are not therapists. We are not applying any form of like actual therapy. This is just the term that's sort of given to this style of analyzing how habits and addictions and things like that are sort of created and maintained. So we're looking at it, we're analyzing it, and we are going to use some of these psychological principles. But again, it should be noted we are not doing any form of therapy. Like that's something that is very important for us. So when we used to look at like what therapy used to be, right? Like we used to look at therapy from the lens of like, Freudian analysis or Freudian therapy, which is sort of like what you think of when you think of like sitting in a therapist's office, like it's like that classic scene from like a movie where someone is like laying on like one of those, what they call it, a chaise lounge or whatever, that big red weirdly shaped chair. And then like, there's like a man in a beard with glasses, saying like, tell me about your mother, like, and then that person just like talks for hours and hours and hours. That's sort of like what, we've all seen that scene in a million different movies. That's sort of that is sort of what psychoanalysis used to be. And that's sort of where psychology began, in this idea of like, you would basically dredge up any and all information about your past, and then that would lead you to being able to see things in a little bit more of an objective, like fair view. It focused a lot on like recreating these like childhood memories and things like that. But here's the thing, like, as we've sort of like continued to evolve the world of therapy and the world of psychology, like we've kind of come to realize that like Sigmund Freud really couldn't have been more wrong about like a lot of stuff. Like don't get me wrong, like we should be grateful for the fact that like Sigmund Freud basically invented the world of psychology, and like therapists exist sort of thanks to him, which is really terrific. But like he was also, just like any other guy of his time, which is like, he didn't believe in women's rights, and like, because he was like, oh, their brains are fundamentally different. It's like the guy who's supposed to know a lot about brains did not know much. And that makes sense, that was where sort of human, education was at the time. But like he was definitely wrong about like a lot of stuff. Like the big criticism of psychoanalysis is that like it is extremely time consuming. It's like the other joke, like I'm sure another thing that all of us have seen in like scenes of a movie is where like the therapist is like, oh, and then the alarm goes off and they're like, and that's our time, and then they just move on, and you can tell like the person's like frustrated. Yeah, that's kind of what psychoanalysis, it's like hours of you just telling these big long stories, like kind of going back and like dredging up childhood memories. And honestly, like it doesn't always have like a very positive effect, whereas sort of where therapy has sort of moved into, where it is sort of nowadays, is the idea of like analyzing what our thoughts are and what our actions are. And this is what we're going to kind of spend the next 2 days talking about. We're going to talk about this today, and we're going to talk about it on Monday. We've sort of, moved out of that idea of just looking at like, your past totally indicates who you are. All the experiences that you've experienced like in your life, like that's 100% what has shaped you and the only thing that matters. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that those things don't matter. Like your past does shape you, but the idea that like that is the only reason you are responding to things the way you are now isn't really the sort of modern take on psychology, which is, a little bit more evolved. In fact, at the end of today's lesson today, one cool thing that I'm going to bring up, I try to do one sort of extra credit assignment per mod that can be worth like 5 hours of attendance. For anybody who's ever missed a day, you can like, do this assignment, and basically it's like attending a free 5 hour, session. And so you get 5 hours of credit on your attendance and stuff. So for anybody who has ever been absent, like it's a really good tool. But what this extra credit assignment is, it's actually listening to 2 episodes of a podcast. And this podcast is actually all about psychology, but the 2 episodes that are really fascinating are actually about what I'm talking about right now, where, the world of psychology is kind of evolved. It's always evolving. Like our understanding of medicine is always evolving. Our understanding of science is always evolving. The same thing is true of like how, we sort of analyze our brains and stuff. And it's about how, like, it's sort of the story behind how, it used to be like all Freudian therapy. And now we're like, that's probably not very accurate. So then we started focusing more on like behavior therapy and behaviors and actions and stuff. And now we're even kind of like, now there's a lot of like new therapy that's kind of transferring out of that and looking more at like, it has much more to do with our thoughts more than it has to do with our actions. And that's sort of what we're going to talk about on Monday when we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy. We'll talk about how it's our thoughts and our emotions and stuff. So it's kind of interesting. We're seeing the world of psychology sort of evolve in real time. Like right now, it's a big thing. And it's been happening for the last few years. And so it's sort of evolving, and right in front of us. So that's what the podcast is about. I'll tell you guys more about that assignment at the end of today's lesson. But it is a really fun 2 episodes of something. Like I recommend listening to both sessions over like the course of like 2 workouts, because they're both about 30 minutes long. So they make really good, it makes a really good thing to listen to while you're working out. So let's go ahead and define behavior therapy, because that's our focus of today's lesson. Today's lesson, my favorite technique, which is sort of in that middle version, like I like cognitive behavioral therapy a lot too. But behavior therapy is sort of near and dear to my heart. I've used this with a lot of my clients to help them sort of like analyze their habits and sort of break out old habits, but also how to kind of create new ones, what is behavior therapy? Well, it's the application of principles that are derived from the scientific research about how we sort of learn to do certain things, right? So about learning to problems and living, right? So like it basically is how we understand individuals' behaviors from the perspective of like learned habits. And learned habits is really what we're sort of analyzing here, like the idea that like, hopefully you guys are starting to have like a little bit of muscle memory. We send out the text message. I mean, this is a bad example for today because I just like sat here and I was like, where is everybody sitting here? And like, quietly. And I realized I had not sent I just forgot to text everybody this morning. Like I just thought it had happened, but it didn't. So that's actually a broken habit. But, hopefully you guys, every day at, 5 or at 8:30 in the morning, like you start to kind of feel like it's like, there's going to be a text message coming in any moment now. And it's like, I got to get ready for class. Right. And, or hopefully every day, like at 5:30, like you feel the same kind of thing. And it's like, it's a good reminder of getting into the habit of like consistently studying, right? We give out homework every other day, and that sort of creates this like really strong sort of reinforced habit of like consistent study. And that's sort of like applying a little bit of behavior therapy in a way, like when I have a client who tells me, it's like, hey, I want to work out like 4 times per week. And I'm like, okay, what days do you want to train? And they're like, let's do like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and then like Friday. And then like next week, it's like, all right, we sit back on for Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday. And they're like, ooh, you know what? Like this week, I'm going to do Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Saturday. And it's like, I mean, first off, like I don't work on Saturdays, but if I was looking at that, I'd be like, you know what? Like, I like this. Is there a way we could get your schedule opened up to where we could do Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday? Get like a really even distribution using like the whole work week there, and keep it consistent. Like those are our times every week, 7 a.m. every single time, right? I will always, always, always try to get my clients set on a regular schedule as often as I can. Like my roommate, I trained him lately, right? 7:30 a.m. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. consistently week after week after week after week. And the reason I do that is because like that way going to the gym doesn't have to be something that requires effort. It isn't something that you have to think about. It's something that happens automatically. It's part of your lifestyle, right? We're trying to create the habit here, right? That's a little bit of applying, this idea of learned habits, right? I want this thing that is sort of unnatural. Naturally it would be like you sleep in until whatever time and you just wake up and go about your day, right? We take that sort of unstructured way of living and we have like a habit that we are trying to get better at that we consistently do until we get really, really, really good at it, right? And so what that is when we're analyzing this is there's sort of three parts to all of our behaviors, okay? Sort of three major ways that we sort of look at this. And we break it down into what is known as the antecedent, the organismic and consequent behaviors. Now, those terms, this is a classic example of like terms that I'm like, I don't like those because they don't paint a picture. And I love my definitions to sort of, feed into the thing that I mean that I'm talking about. So antecedent is a big fancy term. I like to call it a trigger. Right. I think that actually sort of paints the picture of like what an antecedent does. An antecedent is an initial event that causes some type of reaction, right? If every action, has an equal and opposite reaction, right? Well, an antecedent is sort of that initial trigger, right? That sort of kicks things off. It's the catalyst, it's like the enzyme of behaviors, so it's an event that triggers a behavior. Maybe it's an individual has a really hard day at work. There it is. There's their trigger, right? They were at work, their boss yelled at them, that annoying coworker of theirs wouldn't leave them alone. They weren't able to get out of work on time. Traffic was bad on the way home. Just everything, they got a super case of the Mondays, right? So it's an individual has a really hard day of work. So now what that's going to trigger in them, and honestly, like, I guess I should probably just cut this part off. What that's going to sort of trigger in them is that they are then going to sort of seek out comfort, right? Now that they had this like really hard day, they are going to seek some type of comfort, right? And that is where the organismic behavior comes in. And so this is the actual behavior that we're sort of breaking down here. This is the routine, right? They have a trigger and then they have a routine, they have a behavior. And that's associated with that specific trigger. So now it's like every time they have a hard day at work, they're going to seek some type of comfort. What is that comfort? Well, maybe it's been reinforced as some sort of junk food, right? It's like, oh, I had a hard day. And then they like come home and it's like, I'm going to have a bag of potato chips or iced coffee. That's a big one, coffee's really addicting. And like they'll have like a frappuccino, which is a glorified milkshake. They have this like really intense trigger, and then they have sort of an unhealthy behavior that's sort of associated with some type of like junk food in this example that we're using here. By the way, it doesn't have to be something like this. It could be like, when you're like, for me, like I tend to, like I've talked about this before, like I can sometimes have like a bad temper when I'm stuck in traffic. I get really frustrated. So for me, like that, the trigger is like, being stuck in traffic, and this behavior that makes me feel sort of good, even though it's not a good feeling, is just like letting out like a string of, curse words or, like saying like a certain thing and just like venting my frustrations. And it's good to like get that all out rather than bottling it up. But like sometimes like that behavior is not always like the most constructive thing, because then that sometimes gets me going, and then there are consequences afterwards, which if I'm with someone else in the car, they're like, oh, that's an ugly thing to say, there's a consequence, there's some type of outcome that's going to come from a behavior. And for the record, this could be a really good thing as well. There's good versions of this, like if you set your alarm consistently and that alarm becomes your trigger and you wake up at the same time every day, eventually your body gets to a place where the consequence is like you start naturally waking up before your alarm goes off. And you feel really refreshed, so there are positive things associated with this as well. This isn't always, I don't want you guys to think this is always just like sort of a negative 3-step thing. But, you know, this individual who seeks out some type of junk food, there's our behavior, right? They have a hard day at work and then they seek out junk food as a form of comfort. Well, the consequence of junk food, the outcome associated with that behavior is an excessive, you know, intake of empty calories, right? And that's not awesome. So now if we know, like, you know, we can't necessarily change our triggers. We can't necessarily like, you know, get rid of this antecedent that we don't have control over. You know, like there's so many things in our life that we don't have control over. You know, having a hard day at work, like not every day is going to be a great day. You know, you guys are going to have clients that are just unmotivated some days. And let me tell you guys, I don't know if this is just confirmation bias, if this is just like a feeling that like I feel, but like it is very interesting to me. It seems like a lot of clients will all have hard days on what it feels like it's all on the same day. Like you'll walk in and your first appointment's like, it's like, hey, good morning, how are you? And your first appointment's like, I'm having the worst day. Oh, this weekend was terrible. And they're just like, I'm not motivated to work out today. And they're just in a bad mood. And you're like, oh God, sorry to hear it. You know, you can cheer them up, you exercise them, make them feel good, and you know, kick them out of the gym and go on to your next appointment. And then your next appointment walks in and you're like, hey, good morning, how are you? And they're like, I'm having the worst day. And you're like, what is happening today? Like I swear it feels like that sometimes. Like it feels like all your clients are having a bad day on the same day. And it's like by the end of that, like you're just exhausted. Like you've been giving your all like all day trying to cheer people up and like make your sessions lively and this and that, you know, like have these great training sessions. And then like you just walk away and you're just exhausted. And like, you know, it's like if you were to go into the gym and you were to go meet with your trainer and they'd be like, how's your day? And be like, I'm having the worst day. You know, like it's like, oh, I've been infected, you know. I swear, guys, like you're gonna have that, you know. But you know, we can use behavior therapy to sort of retool things in positive ways. If you have a bad day and you need to have some type of something to kind of seek comfort, you know, if we switch out that junk food for something that's just a little bit healthier, like a slightly healthier version, the consequences are going to be much less detrimental. Or if it's like, hey, you have a bad day, maybe you go for a walk, which is actually a healthy behavior that has positive consequences. You're like, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm going to listen to an episode of a podcast or something, take my mind off things, do a little bit of meditation, something. And it's like now this like negative trigger that, you know, used to lead to like negative consequences is leading to positive consequences. It's leading to kind of a good thing. And that's really what behavior therapy is. It's learning how to sort of analyze the things that sort of are our antecedents, right? To analyze our triggers. And I hate that term because it's been co-opted by weirdness lately, but you know, we sort of analyze our triggers and then we sort of look for healthier versions of those behaviors. Is that making sense so far, guys? Everybody following with me?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah, this is like my favorite stuff. I want to make sure everybody's real clear on this because, again, talking about biases, I am very biased towards this being my favorite. All right, so I actually haven't been showing a lot of crash course videos in this course just because like there's sort of other fun videos that I want to show you guys, but I got a really good one here. Crash course classical conditioning. This is kind of a fun video about the history of behavior therapy and sort of how to train a brain. So we're going to talk a little bit about Pavlov's dog here. Pavlov was sort of the big guy who really kind of broke down this sort of behavior therapy and sort of analyzed why it's so easy to train dogs and stuff. For the record, he was not exactly great to dogs. It should be noted that he did not exactly treat these dogs well, but it is fascinating what he was able to learn. Here we go. Fun little, sharing sound, because I always forget to do that. Here we go.
Pavlov. So the name Ivan Pavlov rings a bell. It's because his experiments are among the most famous in the history of psychology. His work contributed to the foundation of the behaviorist school of thought that viewed psychology as an empirically rigorous science focused on observable behaviors and not unobservable internal mental processes. Even though today we view psychology as the science of both behavior and mental processes, Pavlov's influence was tremendous. His research helped pave the path for more experimental rigor in behavioral research right up to the present day. Born in 1849 in Russia, Pavlov was never much for psychology. After giving up on his original aspirations to become a Russian Orthodox priest like his father, he instead earned a medical degree and spent nearly 20 years studying the digestive system, earning Russia's first Nobel Prize in his mid-50s for his research expanding our understanding of how stomachs worked. He didn't study human stomachs, though, because the procedures were terrible and cruel. He studied dog stomachs, and while researching those dogs, he noticed how the animals would salivate at a mere whiff of their dinner. At first, he found all that slobber annoying, but soon started to suspect that this behavior was actually a simple but important form of learning. For us scholars of psychology, we can define learning as the process of acquiring, through experience, new and relatively enduring information or behaviors. Whether through association, observation, or just plain thinking, learning is what allows us to adapt to our environments and to survive. And as Pavlov began to discover, it wasn't only humans who learned. Soon enough, he was turning out his famous series of experiments in which he paired the presence of meat powder, yummy, which got the dogs to drooling, with lots of different neutral stimuli, things that wouldn't normally make you drool, like a certain sound or shining a light or a touch on the leg. Then Pavlov observed after several of these pairings, a dog would start to drool just at the sound or the light or the touch, even if there wasn't any slobber-inducing meat powder around. Animals, he found, can exhibit associative learning. That's when a subject links certain events, behaviors, or stimuli together in the process of conditioning. This may be the most elemental, basic form of learning a brain can do, but that doesn't mean that the processes behind conditioning are or ever were obvious, or for that matter, simple. In fact, the research that's gone into how we're conditioned by our environments has helped shape the science of psychology from a still kind of subjective thought exercise into the more rigorous discipline we know today. And it starred some of psychology's most notable and often controversial figures, including Pavlov, Pf Skinner, and that guy who trained kids to be terrified of furry animals. Okay, I'm not a licensed dog trainer. Do they license dog trainers? But I can break down for you the sequence of steps in Pavlov's famous experiment to help you get a sense of how conditioning works. First, before conditioning, the dog just drools when it smells food. That smell is the unconditioned stimulus, and the slobbering, the unconditioned or natural response. The ringing sound, which at this point means nothing to the dog, is the neutral stimulus, and it produces no drooling. During conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus, the food smell, is paired with the neutral stimulus, the bell sound, and results in drooling. This is repeated many times until the association between the two stimuli is made in a stage called acquisition. By the time you get to the after conditioning phase, that old neutral stimulus has become a conditioned stimulus, because it now elicits the conditioned response of drooling. Sounds super simple, right? If you have a dog, you've probably seen it tap dance at the side of a leash, but in Pavlov's day, this whole series of steps hadn't really been studied in a lab setting or even thought about in scientific terms. Pavlov's work suggested that classical conditioning, as this kind of learning came to be known, could be an adaptive form of learning that helps an animal survive by changing its behavior to better suit its environment. In this case, a bell means food, and food means survival, so get ready. Not only that, but methodologically, classical conditioning shows how a process like learning can actually be studied through direct observation of behavior in real time without all those messy feelings and emotions. This is something Pavlov especially appreciated given his disdain for mentalistic concepts like consciousness and introspection championed by Freud. Behaviorist psychologists like Pavlov's younger American analogs Pf Skinner and John B. Watson also embraced the notion that psychology was all about objective, observable behavior. In his 1930 book Behaviorism, he argued that given a dozen healthy infants, he could train any one of them to be a doctor, artist, lawyer, or even a thief, regardless of their talents, tendencies, or ancestry. Whoa there, Watson! Thankfully, no one gave him any infants. In his most famous, and yes, controversial experiment, Watson conditioned a young child dubbed Little Albert to fear a white rat. Maybe that doesn't sound so bad, but he accomplished this by pairing the rat with a loud, scary noise over and over, and then demonstrated that the terror could branch out and be generalized to include other furry white objects like bunnies, dogs, or even fur coats. So yeah, that would not fly today, obviously, but Watson...
Super not okay, but interesting to know about.
Watson's research did make other psychologists wonder whether adults, too, were just holding tanks of conditioned emotions, and if so, whether new conditioning could be used to undo old conditioning. Like, if you're terrified of roller coasters, but you made yourself ride one 10 times a day for 2 weeks, would your fears fade? For the record, recent exploration has revealed that the boy known as Little Albert sadly died a few years after these experiments, while Watson eventually left academia and got into advertising, where he put all that associative learning to lucrative use. So that's classical conditioning, but we've also got another kind of associative learning, operant conditioning. If classical conditioning is all about forming associations between stimuli, operant conditioning involves associating our own behavior with consequences. The kid who gets a cookie for saying please, or the aquarium seal that gets a sardine for balancing a ball on its nose, they've both been trained with operant conditioning. The basic premise here is that behaviors increase when followed by reinforcement or reward, but they decrease when followed by punishment. And the most well-known champion of operant conditioning is American behaviorist Pnf Skinner. He designed the famous operant chamber, or Skinner box, a confined space containing a lever or button that an animal could touch to get some kind of reward, typically food, along with a device that keeps track of its responses. Okay, time for a debunking break. Other than maybe Freud, no other figure in psychology seems to be as shrouded in lore and misinformation as Pnf Skinner. So I'm just gonna tell you straight that no, Skinner never put any kids in the box. And no, he didn't raise his children without love or affection, and his daughter didn't hate his guts until the day she committed suicide. Deborah Skinner is alive and well, and she loved her dad plenty. Skinner did, however, invent something called an air crib, a climate-controlled box with a window on the front that was meant to keep babies warm and safe while their moms ran around doing their 1950s lady thing. It's not exactly where I'd like to spend the night, but it wasn't remotely the same as the Skinner box. No one knows where all these myths came from, but being a somewhat controversial guy, Skinner had a lot of haters, some of whom were probably happy to perpetuate misinformation. But back to the rat in the box. Basically, the box provided an observable stage to demonstrate Skinner's concept of reinforcement, which is anything that increases the behavior that it follows. In other words, you push the lever, you get a snack, and then you want to keep pushing the lever. But most rats aren't gonna push a lever for no reason. I mean, there aren't food dispensing levers in the natural environment, so operant conditioning behavior requires shaping. Maybe you give the rat a little nibble of food each time it gets closer to the bar, then only when it touches the bar, until little by little, in a series of successive approximations to the desired behavior, you reward them only when they do the thing you're trying to shape them to do. In everyday life, we're all continually reinforcing, shaping, and refining each other's behaviors, both intentionally and accidentally. We do this with both positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement obviously strengthens responses by giving rewards after a desired event, like the rat snack after the lever push, or getting a cookie when you say please. Negative reinforcement is a little trickier. It's what increases a behavior by taking away an aversive or upsetting stimulus, like say get in your car and it does that infernal beeping thing until you fasten your seatbelt. The car is reinforcing your seatbelt wearing by getting rid of that horrible beeping, and it's good. You should wear your seatbelt. It's important to recognize here that negative reinforcement is not the same as punishment. Punishment decreases a behavior either positively by, say, getting a speeding ticket, or negatively by taking away a driver's license. But negative reinforcement removes the punishing event to increase the behavior. So painkillers negatively reinforce the behavior of swallowing them by ending the headache. So by now, hopefully you're getting the picture. There are things that we want and things that we don't want, and we can be taught by way of those impulses to behave certain ways. But it's worth pointing out that conditioning is way more complex than just the cookie in the beeping car. For one thing, ending annoyance or getting a cookie are types of primary reinforcers. You don't have to learn that. They just make innate biological sense. Beeping is annoying, cookies are delicious. But there are other kinds of reinforcers that we only recognize after we learn to associate them with primary reinforcers. Like a paycheck is a conditioned reinforcer. We want money because we need food and shelter, which are still the primary drivers. Plus, just as there are different kinds of reinforcers, so are there various reinforcement schedules. Like those boxed rats were getting continuous reinforcement when they got a treat every single time they hit the lever, so they picked it up pretty quickly. But if one day the rat chow doesn't come, that connection quickly dwindles and the rat stops hitting the lever. This is a process called extinction, and it is important because that's how real life works. Outside of a Skinner box, you're not gonna get continuous reinforcement. All of life is a series of partial or intermittent reinforcements that only occur sometimes. Learning under these conditions takes longer, but it holds up better in the long run and is less susceptible to that extinction. So say a cafe gives out a free cup of coffee for every 10 you buy, while another shop pours a free double shot every Tuesday morning, and yet another has a free coffee lottery that customers win at random. These are all different kinds of intermittent reinforcement techniques that get customers coming back for more. Now, Pavlov, Watson, and Skinner's ideas were definitely controversial, as well as the whole scary rat experiment. Plenty of folks disagreed with their insistence that only external influences and not internal thoughts and feelings shaped behavior. It was clear to many of the behaviorists' rivals that our cognitive processes, our thoughts, perceptions, feelings, memories, also influence the way we learn. We're going to talk about how these other things factor into learning next week when we look more at conditioning, cognition, and observational learning. And yeah, also watch kids beat the face off blow-up dolls. Today, though, you learned how associative learning works, the essentials of behaviorist theory, the basic components of classical and operant conditioning, including positive and negative reinforcement and reinforcement scheduling. Thanks for watching this, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers who make this whole channel possible. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Crash Course, or get a special laptop decal, or even be animated into an upcoming episode, just go to Subbable.com. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Ranjit Bhagwat. Our director and editor is Nicholas Jenkins, the script supervisor is Michael Ronda, who is also our sound designer, and the graphics team is Thought Cafe.
Okay, he kind of alluded to what we're going to talk about tomorrow at the end there, which is like, yeah, there was some controversy here. Like, behavior therapy is all about the idea that like external stuff sort of affects how we internally operate. And doesn't really give any credit to the fact that like our thoughts and our emotions also have a pretty strong effect on us. We'll be looking at the thoughts and emotions side of things tomorrow. But for today, let's take a look at how we sort of go through this process of classical conditioning, right? This idea that we're going to condition ourselves through, stimuli, right? So classical conditioning is sort of the study that we were talking about. It's the Pavlov's dog, right? He sort of observed the fact that like every time food was near, a dog's mouth would start watering. And so then he started ringing a bell while he was also, introducing the food. And eventually the dog started to draw an association between the sound of a ringing bell and getting food. And so the dog would salivate very similarly just from hearing the sound of the bell. So that is classical conditioning. It's learning associations like the bell through unconditioned stimuli and through conditioned stimuli. Unconditioned stuff is going to be the naturally occurring stuff, and conditioned stuff is where, we are sort of having an effect on things. We're actually, sort of modifying stuff. So an unconditioned stimuli is the unconditionally naturally occurring triggers and that trigger unconditioned responses. So like, this is the stuff that's just going to happen naturally in our lives. Like the sun's going to come up every day. We don't have any control over that, what is it, like death and taxes, these are the things that are inevitable in this world. That's not the only thing that's true. There's a lot of stuff that's inevitable. People are going to get in our way. There's going to be traffic. You're going to be late sometimes your hot water heater's not going to heat up as fast as it's supposed to. There's just going to be stuff that kind of occurs in our life. So unconditioned stimuli is the naturally occurring stuff. And so this often results in an unconditioned response. So for instance, let's say you're walking by, you're walking down the street and somebody's got an open window and they're baking pies like crazy. Like we're living in a Disney movie, and so like, you smell your favorite food, that's an unconditioned stimulus, right? You didn't have any control over this. This is just something that sort of happened in your life. So now, like, your brain is going to go, oh my God, that's the smell of, apple pie. I love apple pie. Like your brain is going to start going through the process of like, are we about to eat apple pie? We should definitely be eating apple pie right now. And so then, like, all of a sudden your body starts to do all the things that it gets ready for when it's eating apple pie, right? Which is like, it's going to start salivating, it's going to make you hungry, right? It's going to do all these things because, like, yeah, bring it on, give me that pie, so that is sort of an unconditioned stimuli that is leading to an unconditioned response. Well, we also have like conditioned stimuli. Conditioned stimuli are associated with an unconditioned stimulus that triggers a conditioned response. So let's say like you set an alarm every single day. You slowly start associating that alarm with getting up out of bed. This, by the way, guys, is why the snooze button should not freaking exist. The snooze button is so bad for you. Do not hit snooze on your alarm. Is the best advice I can give you in terms of just life in general. Not only does it like create what's called sleep inertia, and that's a totally different principle that we'll talk about later. Not only does it create that, which is very, very, very bad for you, but also it starts to draw an association. It starts to create an association with like going back to bed rather than creating an association with getting out of bed, right? So we do not like snooze buttons. It is, you are conditioning yourself to be worse at getting out of bed. But we can also create a conditioned response. A conditioned response is learning through repeated exposure to a conditioned stimulus. So let's say you create some type of, put some type of like infrastructure in your life in place. So for instance, like one of the things that I used to do for a little while when I was like when I first started working, early in the morning and like getting up at 5 every day to like go train my clients, that was not something that was very naturally occurring to me. I found that very, very difficult at first, but in my opinion, that's the best time to train people, because like usually you have really dedicated clients in the morning, and so I wanted to work those hours and I wanted to get good at like waking up. And so I'd wake up in the morning and it would just be brutal. I was like, oh, this is terrible, right? And I'd sort of lay in bed until the last minute, and I'd be like, and I'd get up and I would go through that whole process of like, rushing through my morning routine to sprint out the door. And, this is, driving to work, get there by the last second, like all these things that are sort of, great ways to create a stressful environment. So instead, what I started doing is I would take my phone. I was using my phone for my alarm at the time. And I would actually keep it in my bathroom instead. And I would then take like a toothbrush, take my toothbrush, and I would put it on my phone. And that way, like I would wake up in the morning and I'd have to walk across the room and go into my bathroom, and then I'd have to turn my alarm off. And now I'm already on my feet, and then my toothbrush would be in my hand. And so I'd be like, all right, it's time to stay, and I would just already be ready to kind of like do that. So that's very much a conditioned response, right? The naturally occurring thing was for me to kind of roll back over and go back to sleep. But the conditioned sort of version of this was for me to instantly brush my teeth first thing in the morning. How you doing, Derek? By the way, can you do me a favor and hit that mute button for me?
Oh yeah.
Awesome, thanks, man. So that is sort of where we take sort of this unconditioned stuff, and that's how we use behavior therapy to create positive benefits for us in life. I was able to sort of use classical conditioning to do this. Now, that's a really good technique, and classical conditioning is very effective. This is where I like to think of classical conditioning as, like I said, I used the word a second ago. I like to think of it as infrastructure, right? I like to like put a series of things in place that make it much easier for these things to naturally happen. Like for instance, whenever I'm taking care of my roommate's dogs for him, when my morning class is over, like we usually wrap up class right around, I don't know, 10:30-ish, right? Once that's over, I walk downstairs and I feed the dogs at that time. And then like I let them out for a few minutes and then they come back in and they get their breakfast at the same time consistently. And that way, like I don't forget to feed his dogs. So if I do it at the same time every day, I've sort of classically conditioned myself to remember to feed the dogs, right? There's an infrastructure in place, like birds fly, fish swim at 10:30, my class is over and therefore it's time to feed the dogs. It's just sort of a fact of nature. Now, that's great, and I'm a big fan. But if you have a very particularly difficult habit, one of the things that you can do instead of sort of classical conditioning, which is sort of making things sort of happen on their own, is you can use what is called operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is learning by making associations between voluntary behaviors and their consequences. So this is where you are actually going to choose to administer some type of reinforcer, right? So you're actually going to use a reinforcement technique of some type to make this happen. And that's either going to be through things like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishment, or what's called a response cost. So what's great about this is you can sit down with your client. Coaches and clients can sit down and we can identify what our target behaviors are, like the things we are trying to get better at, right? Like somebody give me an example. If I can get a volunteer to kind of speak up here. Somebody give me an example of something they're working on in their life right now. I'll start with me. You guys can take a second to think about it. I like, for instance, I keep telling you guys how I'm trying to like save up a certain amount of money, right? Well, one of the things that I did in order to like make that happen was I opened a new bank account that automatically, and then like I went into like my paychecks thing, like I went into my payroll account. And I attach that new bank account number to that. And it is going to take a certain amount of money out of every one of my paychecks and put it in this other account rather than putting it into my main spending account. And it does that every time for me. So that's using classical conditioning. Like I'm going to get a paycheck, but like putting the money aside is something that requires like a little bit of willpower. And I'm not always going to have that willpower because maybe I want to go, spend money on something, right? So that is an example of using like classical conditioning. So if I wanted to turn that into operant conditioning, I would instead like identify my target behavior, which is pulling money out of my spending account and putting it somewhere else. And what I would do is I would do something. I would add some type of stimulus so that I can draw a positive association with this action. So for instance, if I were to be like, all right, I got paid today, I need to make sure that I pull some of that money out and put it into my other account. And so then like I go through that process, I like transfer the money over, do the thing that I'm supposed to do, right? That habit then needs to be reinforced in order for me to like continually do it. So then afterwards, if I'm like, good job, me, I take a second to like pat myself on the back and I go, downstairs, and it's the one time a week where maybe I have like, a bowl of ice cream or something, something like that. I'm using positive reinforcement to draw an association with depositing this money, right? So anybody in your life, right? Anybody right now on this call, let me ask you, is there anything in your life that you are currently working on, like a new habit that you are trying to create? Anybody got something like this in their life? Who's working on, everybody's got to be working towards something. What's a new habit that somebody in here is working on? Are you trying to wake up at a different time?
For me, I just want to get my certification and, just do my thing, growing my company, the gym. That's my goal, to have my own gym. So that's the first step, that I need my certification and get my clients, and get the, the whole thing is, so the plan is to get my own gym. So that's what I'm, going for.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Thomas, I saw you unmute for a second. Did you have a comment as well?
Oh no, I'm okay.
Okay. So yeah, like that's a good one, Bay. Like you've got this thing that you're working towards, right? So, what we are trying to do, right? Like if you're trying to work towards like getting this certification, what do we have to, like, if I'm your trainer, and I guess we kind of, that is kind of what this relationship kind of is, more of a teacher thing, but like, if we were to analyze that, right, and it's like, okay, so our targeted behavior, like our end goal is to achieve this certification. Now we got to kind of break it down. It's like, what do we know needs to happen in order for us to be able to get that certification, right? And it's like, let's break it down. And it's like, we already know, I know you know all this already, but it's like, oh, you need to consistently study. You're going to need to, know the information. So consistent study is going to be key. Regularly checking in, like learning your anatomy, your physiology, learning how to train your clients, right? And then like you're going to have to open your gym, which means it's like, okay, well, we got to get a business license. We got to make sure that we know where we're going to train. We got to start building our clients. So we got to start developing like a marketing plan. It's like, all of these things sort of have to happen before this other thing's going to occur, right? So if consistent studying, right, is going to be a big part of that, we could use operant conditioning to make us better at consistently doing that, right? To make us better at consistently remembering to like study and do our homework and stuff, we can use operant conditioning. We could use classical conditioning as well, but looking at operant conditioning is like, we're trying to learn an association with some type of like action, right? Or activity, right? So for example, if someone wanted to learn the association, learn to associate a certain time of day with going to the gym, what they would do is whenever that time of day rolled around, they would be instinctively drawn to get out the door and do this. So that's sort of the targeted behavior and sort of the learned response to that is to like, anytime this time of day rolls around, go to the gym. We could do the same thing with like studying for school, right? It's like, okay, well, I'm going to have class every single day, Monday through Friday, and I'm going to try to go to the same session every time. And then like after class is over, I'm going to take 30 minutes to kind of, cool my brain down, take a little bit of a, give myself a reward of some type. Maybe even if it's just like listening to my favorite song or like watching an episode of TV, just relaxing for a moment. And then afterwards, like, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to go do like my, homework. I'm going to study. I'm going to practice the Canvas quizzes and stuff like that. And doing that. And then after I'm done doing that, we need to have some type of like reinforcer. We need to have some sort of external like reinforcer, which is going to make that even better. Now, honestly, that is actually in the form of just like when you see one of the reasons I really like Canvas is like you guys can do your homework and it literally gives you the results like instantly and says like, hey, here's what you did. And you can go back and review those. That little mental pat on the back actually is a positive reinforcer because it's like, hey, good job. Like you got, 14 out of 15 correct. Like nice work, and like you see it's in green and that kind of reinforces this like healthy behavior. But it could also just be like, all right, every time I do my homework, I'm going to reward myself by like, putting on my favorite album and going for like a 10-minute walk and just being like, good job, me. And I'm just going to think about like how awesome it is. I'm going to, sort of daydream about the future and stuff. Those things right there, that's a positive like thing that's going to make you feel really good. That feeling really good is going to reinforce this habit, which means you're going to become slightly addicted to doing your homework and studying and things like that. You're going to get this like, I want to do this thing because I know that afterwards I have this like special me time that makes me feel really good, right? So that's using operant conditioning. It's giving the dog a treat after they sit. Right? Your dog does not, I always say this and this sounds terrible, but it's like your dog does not sit because they love you. Your dog sits because they've been conditioned to do it and they know that there's some type of reward. Now that reward could be love and affection. You can give them a scratch behind the ears. Absolutely, but that's why like, you say sit and then you're like, good job, and they get all excited. They're like, yeah, I did do a good job. Thank you. Like we're using operant conditioning. So there are four sort of pieces to operant conditioning. There's sort of four different techniques that we can use. One of them is positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is the addition of a positive consequence or a positive sort of reward after the person produces a targeted behavior. What's up, Thomas? You're back. We keep losing you. Your internet's being funky today. So positive reinforcement is the addition of something good after you do something that's targeted, something that we created, right? So a client gets to have like a cheat meal if they have like a week of successful healthy eating. That's a great, this is why cheat diets, like cheat meals, have been shown to be actually like a very effective tool when it comes to long-term dieting, because sometimes people will be on like a long-term diet and they'll get very frustrated because like they're not seeing the results that they want. They get kind of like irritated and frustrated and stuff, and they're just like, oh, I'm never going to get to where I need to get. And so then like they kind of fall off the wagon at some point. But by giving themselves like a cheat meal, it's like they're being rewarded for diligently sticking to, you know, this diet, this routine, right? So that's a positive reinforcement. It's like, hey, every week that you know, successfully do this thing, you're going to be rewarded with this, right? So that's using positive reinforcement. That's a form of operant conditioning. Now, there is sort of the exact opposite of positive reinforcement, which is punishment. And punishment is the addition of a negative stimulus associated with a behavior that we are trying to decrease. If we're trying to get rid of a bad behavior, punishment's a really effective tool for this that should be used in specific situations. Now, I'm not a big fan of using punishment with my clients, but I have used it in a couple different ways. Like, for instance, one of the ways that I've used sort of punishment in my sessions is if I have a client who shows up late, sometimes what I'll do is I'll be like, oh, you know what? You didn't show up on time today. I'm not sure we have time to get through your normal routine. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of make up for the calories that we would have burned in a full session by burning that many calories in sort of a shorter period of time. And when I frame it that way, people are like, all right, that sounds good. And then what I do is I put them through the workout of their freaking life. And I try to make them, you know, it just sore as the dickens the next day, you know, a little nauseous maybe by the end of that workout. Like, I just wipe the floor with them. You know, it's like, all right, well, we're going to start off with 1,000 burpees, you know, something like that. Like, and it's like one of those things, you know, I frame it really positively. I'm like, you know, this is, and it is still helping them, like it's helping them reach their goal and stuff. But what that does is that draws association with them being like, oh my God, I'm never going to show up late again. You know, like that was so rough. You know, that is an example of using punishing. But like, honestly, I'm not a big fan of like the whole punishment technique. I think that what it does is it sometimes like draws negative associations with things, and honestly, that you know, then you start associating like this thing that you should really enjoy with something that you kind of don't enjoy. You know, like I don't want my clients to think of the gym as a place of torture. You know, I wanted them to think of the gym as like a place of like, you know, tension release and a place that makes them feel positive. So an example of punishment is, again, we go back to our let's say it's the same client. You know, they get to have a cheat meal whenever they do really well. Well, on weeks that they maybe fall off their diet, they have to do an extra 30 minutes of cardio in response, right? That's an example of punishment. Now, there is also negative reinforcement. Now, negative reinforcement sounds like it would be the opposite of positive reinforcement, but it's not necessarily the opposite. In fact, these actually both work somewhat similarly. Negative reinforcement, well, if positive reinforcement is adding something positive in response to doing a targeted behavior, negative reinforcement is removing something in response to a positive behavior. So in both situations, someone did what we wanted them to do. In positive reinforcement, we rewarded them for doing what we wanted to do. In negative reinforcement, we took away something that they dislike, which is still a reward, in response to doing what we wanted them to do. Okay, so like, for instance, honestly, you know, if you are on like a let's say weightlifting routine, and you put on some muscle and you like the way that you look in the mirror, and then that removes maybe some of the negative emotions or negative feelings. If you're like, if you are like self-conscious about how you look because you're like, oh, I'm too skinny, I don't like the way my arms look, or this or that or something, and then like you work out regularly, and all of a sudden that negative stigma sort of disappears because you're like, well, now I like the way I look. That is an example of negative reinforcement. You've done a very positive thing. You've given yourself by removing this negative stimulus. The classic example is what he said in the video. You get into your car and your car starts beeping, and that's annoying. And so then you do what we want to do, our targeted behavior, which is putting your seatbelt on. And then all of a sudden the beeping goes away and you're like, oh, that's great. Right? Like, it's that relief. That's negative reinforcement. It is removing a negative stimulus as a reward for doing a targeted behavior. So a trainer removes a client's least favorite exercise, or maybe their least favorite activity from a training program if they've had like an excellent week, right? And it's like, hey, you know what? Like, you've been getting your steps in every day. You've been crushing it in the workouts. You know what? Positive reinforcement. It's like, let's go play 20 minutes of basketball instead of, lifting the weights today, because your client maybe likes that better, right? Or negative reinforcement, be like, you know what? You're supposed to do 20 minutes of cardio after today's session, but you've burned so many extra calories this week. Why don't you go ahead and skip the cardio? Let's do a little bit of stretching instead. Give you a little bit of maybe like if I'm qualified, which I am not personally, but you could be, maybe like give your client a massage or something, something else that sort of makes them feel really good. We remove that negative thing and fill our time with something else. That's an example of negative reinforcement. So I actually really like negative reinforcement. I'm not a big fan of punishment as a tool personally in a professional relationship. I think it can be a really effective tool in other ways. But I do really like negative reinforcement. And then there's response cost. Response cost is the removal of positive things to decrease the probability of the response that such removal sort of follows. So what this is like, this is actually sort of removing the reward that's associated with something in response to an untargeted behavior. So let's say your client does something that we are actively trying to avoid. And so then what we do is we remove the reward that's associated with that, so response cost is, honestly, if you think about like a kid who like is throwing a tantrum in the store, and it's like, all right, well, I'm going to take away your toy or whatever. They got a teddy bear on their hand or whatever. Like, I'm going to take that away, which is, by the way, is probably going to make that kid go even more nuclear. But like, that's an example of response cost. Hopefully what we will then explain to this child is like, look, I didn't want to take the bear away, but like, you were throwing a tantrum. And whenever you throw a tantrum, what is associated with that is like the removal of this thing that you enjoy, right? So we remove a positive reinforcer in response to an untargeted behavior. It's like, you did this thing that we don't want to do. And so because of that, you lost this other thing. Honestly, this is like where there are, choices and consequences. I was trying to explain this to someone the other day who was like, kind of criticizing me a little bit. They were like, you're so harsh about like when people like show up late for this thing, and I'm like, well, this thing happens at the same time every single day. And it's like, eventually, like, I'm going to get frustrated enough. I just think you don't get to play. Like, we're going to talk about like Plan Ultimate and stuff, and somebody who shows up literally like an hour late, and it screws up the teams every week, and it's just a whole thing. And they were like, well, that's not really, like, this is a casual thing. And it's like, it's casual, but like, this person's disrespecting everyone else's time. Like, we wait for this person consistently. Eventually, like, we're just going to not let them play. They made the choice to not show up on time. Like, it's not really fair for me to complain that I'm trying to think of a very absurd example here so that I can pull this to the extremes. It's not really fair for me to complain that I don't get to eat at a big fancy New York restaurant. If I want to eat there, I need to live in New York, like that's kind of a weird example, but like, that's the response cost, right? Like, We remove this positive thing in associated with an untargeted behavior. You do a thing that we shouldn't do. Well, unfortunately, you don't get to do this other thing that's maybe a little bit more rewarding. This is actually, I think of response costs when I think of that video that I showed you guys on Friday, where we talk about like the sort of procrastination loop. It's like we have these big things that we want to do in our lives, these big sort of grand aspirations, and sometimes we don't end up achieving these things because like we're making other choices that are actively pulling us away. And yeah, it sucks because like those things are fun, those other choices that we're making, like I was just talking about this yesterday. I was really proud of myself when I was a kid. This is terrible, by the way. I was really proud of myself when I was in high school because I lied and told the teachers that I was doing an independent study for a second language to learn sign language, which is totally not true. But I did learn, I learned enough. I learned the alphabet, but I didn't learn like any actual like words, which if you're doing the alphabet to spell things out in sign language, it takes forever. And so no one does that. So did I know sign language? Absolutely not. Definitely not. But it was enough for me to like be able to take test out. And so I had a free period. So I didn't have to take a second language. I was really proud of myself at the time. And now that I'm an adult, I really regret it because like the skill of learning a second language is something that's really valuable when your brain is like young and fresh. And I super regret because like now when people are trying to like teach me words in like Spanish or whatever, I just don't absorb it. It's like a brick wall and it just bounces off my thick head. And I really regret it. Like I have this response cost where I'm just like, God, I wish I had done that freaking thing. Because now my brain is broken, but that's that's the thing. If I want to actually like learn a second language, I got to put the effort in, and it's like it's one of those behaviors I'm not really willing to actually do. So do I really want it? I don't know. So this is sort of what we're looking at here. So there's a couple different techniques that we're going to apply, both classical and operant conditioning. These are sort of the different sort of ways to apply all these things. And some of them are going to be examples of punishment. Some of them are going to be examples of positive reinforcement. Some of them are going to be examples of classical conditioning instead of operant conditioning. But a lot of these are really, really good techniques. Now, the first one we're going to start off with is something that all of you guys should actually practice in yourselves. You can do this just you alone. This is a really, really great thing to do, but you should be structured about it and you should actually physically write it down. I have used this technique personally to sort of make myself more productive in a couple different ways. It's a really, really, really valuable thing for you to do. And it's called contingency contracting. Contingency contracting is a super great tool where basically you are going to use a very detailed agreement. In this form, we're calling it a contract, to specify what the expectations are, what the plans are, and what the contingencies are for our targeted behaviors. So what a targeted behavior is something that you're trying to achieve. You're trying to open a gym, right? So if we were to put that in a contract and just write this down, it would literally say something like, all right, step one, establish our targeted behavior. Our targeted behavior in this case is a goal, and that goal is to open a successful gym, right? Boom, writing it down. My goal is to open a successful gym. Bam, right? So the client and the trainer are going to sit down together and establish what the appropriate behaviors are. Maybe with a client, it's like, my goal is to increase my fruit and vegetable serving to 4 per day. My goal is to walk 100 minutes a week. My goal is, whatever it is, right? You're going to establish your targeted behaviors. Then we as the trainer are going to monitor their progress regularly. So like every week they check in, we're going to say, hey, how many minutes did you walk this week? How many fruits and vegetable servings did you get consistently if you were to average them out every day? And it's like, well, I got 4 servings on Monday. I got 5 servings on Tuesday. It's like, that's a big improvement. You know, it's above and beyond. But then like on Wednesday, I was like, oh, well, now I can cheat a little bit. So then I only had like 2 servings. And it's like, okay, well, that, we were +1, but now we're -2, right? So it's like if we average them out of the day, it's like, all right, well, we get about 3.8 servings a day overall. We're a little bit below the line there, right? So now like we're monitoring our progress. So we're drawing attention to whether or not we are on the path to actually achieve this goal, right? To act out. Friggin' A. Literally a word for do. Why am I having such a hard time thinking of this word? Whatever. Are we on task to actually achieve our targeted behaviors, right? We're monitoring our progress. So that can be through journaling. It can be through just checking in, right? But the client, I do recommend adhering to self-monitoring. Self-monitoring in particular, guys, has been shown to be very, very effective. Yes, you can check in with your client and just ask them and be like, hey, like how many, and then like we can write it down and stuff. But like when they are consistently doing it and tracking it themselves, it has been shown to be a very effective tool. So I underline this just because like I always encourage you guys and I always encourage the clients. Like I said, keep a workout journal, guys. It's huge. Self-monitoring has been shown to be much more effective in monitoring our behaviors. You can monitor it yourself, like you, the trainer, could do it, but trust me, it's much more powerful when the client does it. Then step 3, we are going to deliver consequences. Now, delivering consequences, again, I want to be clear here. The word consequence, oftentimes we associate with negative stuff, but losing weight is a consequence of exercising regularly. Having a healthy heart is a consequence of eating a good diet and exercising regularly, right? Like there are like consequences has been kind of co-opted. It makes it sound like it's a negative thing. Consequences can absolutely be positive. Half of the consequences in the universe are positive. It's a 50-50 split. So for instance, we're going to deliver consequences. Now you're going to choose how you're going to do this, right? You're going to choose how to deliver consequences. Maybe it's through operant conditioning. Maybe that consequence is negative reinforcement. Maybe it's positive reinforcement. In this example here, we're going to use positive reinforcement, right? The trainer will use positive reinforcement, or maybe they'll use negative reinforcement, or maybe they'll use punishment. Maybe there's response costs in response to the targeted behaviors, right? So our client did or did not do what they were supposed to do. Did it match with the contract that we set earlier? If it did, great, let's reward them, right? Give them like a positive reinforcement, right? If they didn't do a targeted behavior, let's deliver maybe response cost, or maybe we deliver punishment, that is the sort of third step here, right? So make sure things that you're doing, make sure that you're clearly specifying this. This is also part of establishing the contract. A lot of times you will say that in the beginning of the contract and be like, all right, so our goal is to exercise 5 times this week. And then I'm going to check back in with you on Monday and see if that happened. If you did, then we are going to do 20 minutes of yoga today at the end of our session. If you didn't, I'm going to put you through a 20-minute cardio circuit. And so now it's like, all right, so we've established it in the contract. So then on Monday, we monitor progress and say, how many times you make it to the gym this week? And they're like, I made it all 5. And it's like, great. And we go through 40 minutes of our normal training session. Last 20 minutes, we reward them with a little bit of yoga, maybe that's their favorite thing. So there's positive reinforcement, or maybe they show up and they're like, I just couldn't get out of bed. I was tired, and it's like, all right, well, we're going to make up for that lack of calorie burn from that session. And we're going to try and do it in 20 minutes, which means we're going to be working really hard for the next 20 minutes. Right. And so we're delivering consequences. And then lastly, things that you should always be doing whenever it comes to using this technique, you should be maximizing generalization. So what generalization is how to maintain behaviors over a very good length of time. Okay, so you are finding a way to make this generally part of their life, right? Maximizing generalization is sort of putting it on autopilot. This is where, like, yes, you are going to use operant conditioning, but honestly, it kind of uses the sort of principles of classical conditioning, which is just like automatic, responses to things. So the coach should ensure that the client has the ability to adhere to the program. It should be as natural as possible. So I'm going to use a weird example. I'm going to use an example from my past here that has to do with Sochi. I just thought of something. Derek, we're meeting later this week in person. Today's day 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We're meeting on Friday this week. Remind me to get you your textbook on Friday, because we were supposed to do it last time, but we missed you. Anyway, I just thought of that. But thinking about like your Sochi bags, so it's kind of an interesting thing. When we were in person at Sochi, we were really strict about making our students wear their Sochi t-shirts. We wanted everybody in uniform, basically. We were trying to create that habit of like, wow, man, you want to dress for work, and so it was actually like a big deal that back in the day. And I remember when I first started working at Sochi, kind of like, ruffling some feathers, because I was like, hey, are we supposed to make our students wear their clothes every their Sochi shirts every day? And they were like, yeah, absolutely. That's a priority. And I was like, okay. Do we have casual Fridays? And they were like, no, we're not doing casual Fridays. And I was like, okay. Because we only give people 4 t-shirts. And I was like, and we go to school 5 days per week. And they're like, yeah, well, they can do laundry. And I'm like, are you trying to make this difficult on people? Like, are you trying to make this as hard to adhere to as possible? And I'm thinking like how to maximize generalization, right? Maximizing generalization is making all of this behavior change stuff, guys. You need to make it as easy and natural as possible. I was like, you've got to give everybody 5 t-shirts. There is no student on this planet who is going to want to do laundry in the middle of the week when we're also asking them to do homework and this and this. Like, this is a school for adults. Like, this isn't high school. Like, everybody's got like a life to live. They're probably working 40 hours a week and coming to school. I was like, there's no way. You've got to start giving out 5 t-shirts. And they were like, well, they could always just like double up. And I was like, not in the PFT program. Like, we got people we are making our people sweaty in class every day. And so like I ruffled a lot of feathers, and it kind of, gave me a reputation at work and stuff. But I was thinking that where I'm just like, you've got to maximize generalization. If it is difficult for your client to adhere to a new habit, they're not going to adhere to that new habit, it should be natural and, as naturally occurring as possible. And that is where, you need to analyze and continue monitoring progress. If you notice that like, you are applying behavior therapy with your client and your client is not improving, it could be it could be that you need to change things up. You need to make it more naturally part of their life, This is why I'm a really big fan of this first technique right here, which is called pre-macking. So this was created by a guy, psychologist, David Pre-Mack. Pre-macking is a technique. It involves pairing a targeted behavior with a naturally occurring behavior or a likely behavior. Does anybody in here ever do this? I'm actually looking at particularly my guys. I'm not saying that like, Bay, it's not likely that you do this as well, but I do find that like women tend to be a little bit better and a little bit more organized at this. But Thomas's and Derek, question for you guys. When you are trying to remember to like, go out for the day and like, or maybe like go out, like, dress up for like a date or a night out with somebody or something, do you pull your clothes out ahead of time and then set them out so that you remember to do it? Bay, you could chime in as well. Like, I don't know if anybody, but like, I find that like the only way that I remember to like, dress nicely, because I'm used to wearing shorts and a t-shirt every day for work, and that's like my normal garb, I have to like pull it out ahead of time. And I don't know if that's just a guy thing, but I feel like it may be.
What's the question again? I'm sorry. What was the question?
Do you pull, like when you have to remember to like get dressed up for something, do you pull your clothes out like almost like 24 hours in advance and like set them aside so you're like, and then you see it all day and you're like reminds you? Do you do that?
No, I don't do that.
I have to do that because like I will literally just be like, all right, it's time to go somewhere, and I'll just like walk out of the house and then get in my car and I'm like, crap, I probably should have dressed up for this, you know, like going to like dinner with friends or something like that. I should put on jeans, you know, like I have to do that. I have to do that. And I don't get memory. Tom, I hear Tom. I actually can't hear you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you do that.
Can you hear me now?
So that's a big thing. Sometimes I'll leave my shoes by the door. That's a big one. And then like I can't open my door without remembering to change into nicer shoes. So that's like one of the things that's what pre-macking is. Pre-macking is pairing something that is sort of naturally occurring with something that you are trying to get to occur more often. So for instance, earlier I mentioned like putting my toothbrush on my cell phone, right? I'm going to turn my phone off. I had, the freaking thing is going to keep beeping if I don't, right? So pairing that with like immediately brushing my teeth, maybe brushing my teeth instantly is not a naturally occurring behavior, but if it's paired with something that is a naturally occurring behavior, that's an example of pre-macking. This could be a really, really great tool. A really good example of pre-macking, guys, if you've got a client who maybe they enjoy like smoothies, maybe they go, get smoothies regularly with like a friend, right? Like, or get coffee with a friend, right? Putting a coffee bar or a smoothie bar in gyms is an example of like how gyms started reinforcing people's behaviors to get people to come to them more often. They started opening juice bars. They started putting coffee in places like that. Look at, is it Chase Bank or is it Capital One? One of those banks, what is it? Bank with coffee shop. They started doing this. Capital One banks started like, they're not just banks anymore. There's one on Hollywood Boulevard, like Hollywood Boulevard, Capital. Where is that? I mean, this is it, but I want to see an inside picture. Yeah, there it is. So check this out. This is literally, this is on Hollywood Boulevard. That's a bank. There's the tellers in one section, but it's a coffee shop in the other. And so like they're enticing people, like people are going to get coffee, right? Like that's it's the most American thing in the world. Like, like we're going to have, somebody's going to get coffee, but like this draws them into the bank. Maybe the bank is like, well, we're not necessarily a likely behavior. So if we pair it up with this thing that is a likely behavior, people are much more likely to sort of participate in it. So pre-macking is a really effective tool. I love to like, use pre-macking where like I have a client who maybe doesn't necessarily like, walking or getting their steps in per day, but it's like we pair it. It's like, all right, well, let's get used to doing that. What is something that you do every day? And it's like, oh, well, I always watch the Joe Rogan podcast or whatever. And it's like, great. Well, could you do that if you were walking down the street, or could you do that if you were like taking a lap around the park, or could you do that on the treadmill? And I was like, yeah, I probably could. And it's like, all right, well, let's pair, that with that. And it's like, from now on, the only time you listen to Joe Rogan is if you're like walking on a treadmill, So there we go. We paired an unlikely behavior with a likely behavior. If you guys could see my monitor here, you would see sticky notes attached all around it, which are reminders for me to do like certain things. And those sticky notes are an example of pre-macking. I'm definitely going to look at my monitor every day because it's part of my job. But whether or not I'm going to remember to call my friend Rebecca today, which I've written down right here underneath this screen, maybe I'd forget. This is helping me not. So that's an example of pre-macking, and that's using classical conditioning. We've also got stimulus control. Stimulus control is another one that's like really effective. This creates conditions where it's basically impossible, or at least very unfavorable, for a desired behavior to occur. This is a really good example of like negative reinforcement. This is the idea of like stimulus control. Is it's like, all right, yeah, you can have that donut, but you got to climb to the top of the Empire State Building to get it. You know, like it makes it like very difficult or almost impossible for you to actually like do. This is a good example. Like the example, oh, that's the example that I've written down here actually. Removing ice cream from the house in the hopes that like, look, I tell my clients, I'm like, you want to give yourself a treat, you want to reward yourself for like a really good week of working out with like, you know, ice cream or something like that. Great, go for it. But don't leave it in your house passively, because that's something where like, you know, you could do that where it becomes untargeted or unconditioned, right? Like you're not purposefully choosing to get ice cream. It's just something that's passively happening. That creates a bad habit. Instead, why don't we make it a little bit difficult where it's like, you want it, you can still have it, but you have to put your shoes on, you have to leave the house, you got to pay a little bit more, Baskin Robbins, right? These things that you have to do. That is an example of stimulus control. That particular is an example of like what we call environmental stimulus control, which is reducing the availability of something within your environment. There's also like stimulus narrowing, which is like you only associate this one thing with like a particular action or a specific setting. So for instance, I used to be a total soda addict. Coca-Cola, I was a major addict as a kid. That and Mountain Dew Live Wire, those were the two that I was super obsessed with as a high schooler. And so when I got into college, I was like, man, I gotta cut this out. It's number one, expensive, and number two, it is super bad for me. And so I was like, how do I eliminate this? And so what I started doing, I was like, you know what? The only time I'm gonna have like soda now is when I go to the movies, and that's true to this day. That's an example of like stimulus narrowing for me. It's like, where do you drink soda? I only drink soda when I'm at the movie theater. You know, it's also pretty much the only time that I like have popcorn, you know, but like now it's like, you know, I only go to the movies maybe once a month, maybe a little bit more than that. So that is doing a lot less damage than it normally would, you know. So that's an example of like stimulus control. And those are really, you know, that's a really effective technique to apply you know, this classical and operant conditioning, you know, and, you know, we can use that with our client. We can still apply this idea of like contingency contracting, right? And that's like, we establish like a targeted behavior, we monitor that progress, and then we deliver those consequences. That consequence could be like, all right, well, you said you were gonna do this thing, so we're gonna limit how much, you know, we have exposure to that thing. That's using stimulus control, right? And then pre-macking is a good example of maximizing generalization, where it's like, we're going to pair this thing that you are definitely naturally going to do with something that you maybe naturally, you know, like even if it's just something like, hey, you know, I want you to have a glass of water at every meal. If you are unlikely to keep yourself hydrated, but you are definitely going to have like a breakfast and a lunch and a dinner, well, now you have to remember to like, you know, just have a glass of water with every single one of your meals. That's going to help you stay much more hydrated. If you're like, oh, I just never remember to drink enough water. And it's like, well, you do remember to eat. So pair the two up. Do the thing that you're unlikely to do while you're doing the thing that you're likely to do. Now, another thing that's also very important is the idea of modeling. This is actually something that you guys should absolutely be doing for all of your clients. Modeling is a visual demonstration with a specific action so that it makes it easier to replicate it, right? So this is a really good way for us to like acquire new skills. You know, one of the things I encourage my clients to do is like, I actually encourage my clients to watch inspiring stories. I have the habit of texting my clients fun, inspirational videos that I find. I don't expect everybody to necessarily watch all of them, but I love having my clients watch inspirational stories. It's like one of my favorite things to do. And so like I'll send them just like a link to a really cool story of someone who lost like a lot of weight or someone who improved their posture. I have like a giant library of really inspirational stuff like that. But that's an example of modeling, because like when they see it, they start to like realize like it's a reality, it can happen. We are going to talk way more about modeling. I think on Wednesday, I want to say, when we talk about using imagery and visualization. Even just like, this is why vision boards, I don't particularly have like a vision board, but like, you know, sometimes people are like, well, I put a picture of a Ferrari on my bathroom mirror, and every morning I'd wake up and I'd see that Ferrari. Pre-Macking, right? But also like that reinforced the habit that like eventually I need to earn enough money to like buy a Ferrari someday. And so like, you know, they started like looking at this picture, and then they started like watching videos of how people did this and how they did that. And then it's like, well, I'm going to live my life like that. I'm going to live off of this template, off of this model. So that's where an example of modeling is also very similar to classical conditioning. So all of these are really good behavior therapy techniques. I like all of them. I don't think any of them, I think that this is where you have to have this wide variety of different things you can try, and goof around with it, guys. Try different techniques in your life as well, you know, hack your habits. So we got sort of a 6-step process, right? First thing we're always going to do when we set this out, again, this is kind of similar to the 4 steps we looked at earlier, but the first thing you're going to do is like carefully describe, carefully define the behaviors, right? So like if you, let's say you're coaching somebody, right? And you're trying to get them to go through a speed ladder and do like an icky shuffle, right? For those of you who don't know, really quickly, you know, this is sort of a little, it's an agility drill, that, you know, it's complicated. It's a sort of a several piece thing. So if we're trying to get somebody to learn how to do this, let's, you know, sort of go through this process. Let this ad wrap up. Skip forward just a little bit. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, over and over and over. Left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right, left, right. So that's sort of that's the behavior, right? There's the desire, but that's the play that we're trying to generate. And then we're gonna have our client try it. We have them try to execute that play, right? Maybe they goof it up a little bit, they kick the speed ladder, they do the wrong combination of steps. So now our job is to judge the correct or incorrect execution. So we're going to say, all right, I liked how fast you went through the ladder, but one thing is like, we got to go for a little bit more accuracy here. Try stabbing the earth more with your toe. You're kind of on your heels right now, and that's slowing you down a little bit, right? So then we judge and describe what they did wrong. It's right, they're on their heels, right? And so then we're going to model what we're talking about. It's like, so here's what you were doing. So then we go through maybe on our heels, and it's like, here's what I want you to do. We get them more up on the balls of their feet, right? And then we have them imitate that correct execution, maybe in slow motion, where they kind of go through it again. Okay. So it's like, all right, well, now let's take you through that one more time, right? Now you could do this, by the way, with any habit or anything that you're trying to create. It's really easy to describe it when we're talking about like going through a speed ladder or going through like a specific exercise. Like physical behavioral coaching is always a really good way to kind of understand this, but this could absolutely be mental or emotional as well, where it's like, all right, next time you feel like you're going to lose your temper, you're going to fly off the handle, right? What we're going to do instead is we're going to count down from 10 and see if like we can, and focus on our breathing and see if that calms us down. So we are defining the behaviors, and then we're going to ask them to execute that play. So we ask them, it's like, all right, next time come back to me next, I want you to describe the next time you lose your temper. So you meet up with them again. It's like, hey, how's the temper going? It's like, it's like, did you execute properly? And it's like, you know what? Like I honestly, I forgot to do it. I just like flew off the handle. I went into a rage so quickly that I wasn't able to sort of control myself. So then we're going to judge the execution. It's like, all right, well, walk me through what happened, right? So we have them sort of like verbally walk us through so that we can judge the execution. We're going to describe what they did wrong. It's like, all right, so it sounds like, maybe the problem was it sounds like this was a really sudden thing. It took you by surprise. You didn't know you were going to lose your temper when it happened. So maybe we need to be a little bit more prepared and sort of like think about like, you were talking to this person. Maybe we need to be aware of the fact that like that person tends to sort of trigger these negative emotions in us. So we need to be a little bit mentally prepared going, and we need to have a plan of action going in. So we describe, the correct execution. It's like, I want you to think about that next time you like speak to this person, and be ready that you may need to count, you may need to just say like, hey, I need a second, step back and like calm down. And then we would actually sort of like, imitate the correct execution. We would sort of maybe role play and take them through that. Like I said, we're going to talk more about the whole modeling thing, and that we'll talk way more about that when we get to imagery, because that's going to be a huge part of imagery. But it applies very well to physical stuff, but it doesn't always have to be physical. Now, when it comes to behavior coaching, one other thing that sometimes is going to need to occur is some assertiveness training. Now, NASM's not gonna, they don't really have too many test questions about assertiveness training, but this is something that will sometimes happen. Assertiveness is your ability to sort of maintain your own rights. If someone's like, hey, I want you to do this thing, and it's like, nope, I'm not comfortable doing that, so no. Like an assertive person kind of stands up for themselves, right? And is able to do that. Not everybody has that. This is where sometimes you'll be working with a client and it's like, they just need to learn how to actually say no. They're not so good at saying, maybe they're a people pleaser. Maybe they're just not so good at sort of standing up for themselves. So, if it's like oftentimes it's like someone who is trying to stick to a diet, but then their friends are like, oh, come on, be fun, come out with us. And it's like, hey, like, no, this is important to me. Like I'm trying to, adhere to this thing. Or maybe it's like, oh, you can skip the gym. And it's like, no, I really can't. Like, again, like this is something that's valuable to me. I'm really trying to like improve myself in this way. And it's important to me that like you respect that. It's like, sometimes people are just like, it's like, you're right. Like, they're just not good at sticking up for themselves. So we can teach our clients like, look, first things first, if you're trying to learn how to be more assertive and you're trying to like talk to somebody, learn how to maintain eye contact. And when it comes to your body posture, be open instead of closed. This is actually like closing you down, and that's not helping. Use a strong tone, use a strong inflection. Also, don't forget, you should bring this up at the right time. Sometimes people are just not ready to hear certain things. And then make sure that the content is always like relevant. That's going to keep you from sort of flying off the handle. But learning how to be more assertive like that and sort of stand up for yourself, sometimes you're going to have those conversations with your clients. A lot of times it's like their spouse. Happens all the freaking time where you'll have like a client. It's like, hey, how's the diet going? It's like terrible. My husband keeps, telling me to eat this, or my wife keeps making these really unhealthy meals. And it's like, well, have you told them that like, you would appreciate it? And it's like, well, I have, yeah, but they're not really like, And I was like, but they want to do this thing. And it's like, well, have you told them that it's like important to you and that it sort of hurts your feelings? Like, you don't feel good when they're doing this? It's like, no, I haven't really explained that. And it's like, well, maybe you should, it doesn't have to come from a place of like, you're the worst. It just has to come from a place of like, hey, this is the thing that I'm doing. So that is behavior therapy in a nutshell. Let's, at the very end here, tie this to how we would actually apply this to the various clients that we're going to have. Now, like I said, I keep saying this, we're probably not going to meet too many pre-contemplators, but if you somehow have a pre-contemplator client, right? This is somebody who's not intending to make a major lifestyle change. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get them ready to consider making that change. So a really effective tool is going to be pre-macking, right? Maybe they're not likely to start going to the gym. Maybe they're not likely to start changing their diet, but they are likely to get on the internet. So if you change their homepage to, MSN Health or something like that, that could be a really good example of using pre-macking, right? For a pre-contemplating. You're educating them on the benefits of a healthy lifestyle. Or maybe you just like cover the house with healthy magazines and articles and stuff, right? That's a really good example of a pre-contemplate. Again, the object is not to get them to start exercising. The object is to get them to start thinking about wanting to exercise. That's where some people have to start. which is also why we don't run into that many in our actual jobs. Contemplators are people who are like, all right, wait, I get it. I need to work on my diet, right? Like they've accepted the fact that like, yes, they need to make a change. They're not ready to do it today, but they are ready sometime, maybe down in like a 6-month period. So the focus should be much more on like, creating behavior change that's about identifying how they could do this and how it is not as daunting as they may think it is. They're like, I want to start exercising, but I'm just afraid of like getting injured. I'm afraid of like, the time that it's going to take. I'm afraid of the financial commitment. It's like all these things. They got all these reasons why they are just thinking about it rather than actually doing it, right? So instead, maybe it's like, smoothie time or massage time. And it's like, well, what's something that you do enjoy doing? And it's like, well, maybe you enjoy like going to Jamba Juice. And it's like, all right, well, that's great. That there are juice bars like in the gym, right? And it's like, maybe you're not necessarily like, if you're getting, juice for breakfast every morning, what if you were eating breakfast on your way out of the gym? Because like, you come to the gym first thing in the morning and that's how you roll out of bed and you start exercising regularly. And then you can have, that healthy smoothie that you enjoy so much every single day. And it'll be like a reward for exercising. Could you see yourself doing that? And I'm like, yeah, I can see it. It's like now they start to kind of see themselves now as like, maybe I could do that. They're not necessarily coming to the gym all the time. They're just starting to kind of like associate these things together. Or maybe, same thing could be said of like massages, right? Now, if you got a client in the preparation stage, they're intending to make a change sometime in the next like 30 days, right? Well, this is focused on getting them prepared for actually doing this, right? So maybe it's like overcoming their fears. You try a little bit of relaxation training, right? Identify a fear or a barrier that they have about like, going to the gym. And then provide them with 3 ways that they can sort of relax and sort of overcome that fear or that anxiety, right? And so we actually it's like we set up a way for them to sort of see themselves actually do this. Like, all right, well, look, this is going to happen. I always warn my clients, like constantly that they are definitely going to fall off their diet. That is going to happen. It happens to everyone. There's no one who can adhere to a diet perfectly. I've never met the person on this planet, so we need to have a plan in place for when that occurs. And that's okay. That's part of being human. But when it occurs, how are we going to be prepared? What are we going to do afterwards? And then if your client's in the action stage, this is the easy one. This is like, we're just trying to create like some positive reinforcement here, maybe, negative reinforcement or whatever tool we decide to use. And it's like, they're actually beginning to change. We're going to focus on behavior therapies that are going to focus where we give them some type of reward. It's like, hey, every time you come to the gym, I'm going to be here high-fiving you, cheering you on. I'm your cheerleader, I'm your personal cheerleader. Every time you come to the gym, you're going to feel great afterwards. Yeah, you're going to be a little tired and stuff, but like, I'm going to stretch you out. One of my favorite ways, guys, I love to do a little bit of Pnf stretching with my clients at the end of their sessions. That is a super effective technique to get someone to keep coming back because they're like, I love the stretching, but I feel so good when I get stretched out at the end of our session. And it's like, well, then what do you want to do? It's like, I want to get to the end of my session. And so like, that's a great way to reinforce. That's an example of positive reinforcement, using a reward. For a good session, you get stretched out afterwards. And then clients who are in the maintenance stage, let's update the contract, right? We go back to that contingency contracting idea. And it's like, let's make this harder. Let's set something, let's set some new goals and, to overcome and get us to sort of the next level beyond where we are now. It's like, now that you are, a novice and you've successfully did it, let's make you an apprentice. Once you're an apprentice, let's make you an expert. Once you're an expert, let's make you a master. We're always trying to get our clients to that next level. You get your squats, let's do some squat jumps. You get your squat jumps, let's do some box jumps. So that is how we are sort of evolving the various different techniques of behavior therapy. Now, one thing I do want to mention, I'm going to put a link in today's email. To this podcast. There's 2 episode special on this podcast called Invisibilia. Invisibilia is all about psychology. So it's a little psychology podcast. And there are these 2 episodes here, Dark Thoughts and The Locked In Man. Both of these are really, really good episodes, all about how the world of psychology is sort of in a big upturn right now and how it's kind of changing. So this first episode, Dark Thoughts, is about a guy who starts having really violent thoughts out of nowhere. And he can't really explain why. And this episode's all about like our thoughts and how it sort of interacts with our behaviors. And then The Locked In Man is about a guy who was paralyzed and everyone thought he was brain dead, and he was not. He was entirely conscious the entire time. He had what is called locked in syndrome, which is probably one of the scariest things that you can freaking think of. And it's where all outward signs make it appear as if you are completely a vegetable, but it turns out you are completely conscious the entire time. And he has all these stories about how he remembers, like, nurses like bathing him, and it was just like ice cold and it was like torture. But he couldn't express himself in any way. And so nobody had any idea that they were sort of, I guess, treating him poorly. But so both of these episodes are really, 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 really cool. They're fascinating. They both have wonderful, happy endings. So I really recommend listening to them. And I will give you 5 hours of attendance credit. Derek, you showed up an hour late today, for instance. So it is a very valuable thing for you to do. I really recommend listening to these podcasts. So if you listen to these podcasts, send me an email. It doesn't have to be like a book report or anything like that, but just give me an email, 1 page on, what you thought of both of episodes. Tell me a little bit about what you did, and I will throw 5 hours of extra credit your way here at Sochi. So it'll make up for, some attendance issues if you've missed some class. I really recommend this. I know some of you guys, I'm looking at some of these names and I'm like, you never miss class. It's also still very valuable, but hopefully you've got at least one absence. That's a weird thing for a teacher to say. So I can give you some extra credit, but I'll put a link to that and a link to and a description of like what I want from you guys. Either way, I really recommend it. It's really fun to listen to while you're working out. They're really, really cool stories. So